September 20th, 1942. Stalingrad was no longer a city so much as a skeleton of brick and twisted steel, crouched on the edge of the Volga. Smoke hung in the streets like a low ceiling, thick with brick dust and cordite, and somewhere beneath the constant rumble of artillery, you could still hear the small sounds that meant the place was not dead yet. Boots scuffing broken glass, a rifle bolt eased forward with a thumb, the sharp cough of a single shot cutting across the roar. In the shattered courtyard of what used to be a worker's dormitory, a man lay flat on the cold concrete, his cheek pressed into dust, one eye open behind the rough notch of a rifle sight. His name was Vasily Zaytsev, and in that moment he looked less like a hero of socialist propaganda and more like what he had always been at his core, a hunter waiting for something to make a mistake. Across the open ground, through a jagged hole where a wall had once been, a German soldier appeared for half a heartbeat. Helmet first, then shoulders, then the briefest shift of weight as he moved from one pile of rubble to the next. The range was more than 300 meters, the air full of shifting smoke, the target half hidden. Zaytsev did not think in those terms. His world narrowed on the exact part of the man that mattered, the small triangle from collarbone to chin where fabric stretched over bone, and on the familiar feel of the rifle trigger under his finger. The shot cracked, sharp and flat. Through the sight, he saw the German's head snap back as if pulled by a string. The body dropped out of view. He did not smile. He did not move. A sniper's worst enemy was habit, and he had learned that the second after a kill was the most dangerous time of all. Men relaxed then, lifted their heads, allowed themselves a quick look or a whispered joke. That was when the other side's sharpshooter, watching for just that movement, would fire. So Zaytsev stayed welded to the concrete, dust on his lips, eye still at the sight, waiting to see who would come to drag the body away. Someone always did. Fear and discipline both demanded it. The Germans did not like to leave their dead in Soviet hands, and they did not like what it did to morale to see familiar uniforms lying face down in the open. A second helmet appeared, low this time, cautious. The man crawled rather than ran, inching toward where his comrade had fallen. He reached out a hand. Zaytsev shifted his aim by a fraction, measuring the angle as if he could feel the distance in his teeth, and fired again. The rescuer's hand jerked open, suddenly boneless. The helmet dropped. The body slumped. 2 shots. 2 men who would never again set foot in the ruins of Stalingrad. Somewhere far behind, in some German town that still had glass in its windows and food on the table, there were families who had no idea that their sons' lives had been narrowed down to a moment in a courtyard, measured by a man's breathing. That was how it began, for most people who would later read his name in newspapers and on wartime posters. To them, he arrived fully formed as the hero of Stalingrad, the sniper whose tally of German dead would climb past 200 in a little over 2 months. But for Zaytsev, the war had begun long before the first German crossed the Soviet border. It had begun in the Ural foothills, with a boy and a rifle and lessons that smelled of gun oil and pine sap. He was born in 1915 in a village in the Urals, a place where winters were long and food depended less on markets than on what you could take from the land. His family were peasants and hunters, men for whom a rifle was not an emblem of power, but a tool as necessary as an axe. Before Vasily could write his name, his grandfather put a small, worn Mosin-Nagant in his hands. The stock was too long, the metal was cold. His grandfather did not soften his voice for the boy's age. "You aim small," the old man said, pointing across a valley at a distant rock. "You see the animal's eye, not the whole body. You don't waste bullets. Bullets are money. Money is time we don't have." They hunted wolves and deer, stood for hours in the snow watching the way wind curled across drifts to guess direction, learned to judge distance not by guesswork, but by landmarks, the height of a tree line, the known span of a creek. When they fired once, because sometimes you only got once. If you missed, the family went hungry. If you hit, there was meat on the table and a pelt that might buy boots. The boy learned to control his breathing, to feel the tremor in his shoulders when he held still too long and force himself to ignore it. A rifle became an extension of his body, the sight an extra eye. Those lessons went with him when he left home. Like countless rural boys, he went looking for something beyond the limits of his village. He found the Soviet Navy. In peacetime, the fleet seemed an adventure. He joined the Pacific Fleet and became a clerk, a petty official with a neat uniform and a desk somewhere far from gunfire. He filed reports, kept track of stores, lived a life that would have been comfortable if comfort had ever been what he wanted. When war came in 1941 and the Wehrmacht smashed into the Soviet Union, he watched the news of burning cities and retreating divisions from thousands of kilometers away, on a coastline where nothing moved but fishing boats and the occasional patrol vessel. It felt wrong. The war was eating his country, and he was behind a desk. He began to send letters, asking to be transferred to the front. The first request vanished into the bureaucracy. The second earned him a cautious reply. The third succeeded. By the summer of 1942, the petty clerk from the Pacific Fleet was on his way west, toward a city on the Volga, whose name would become synonymous with ruin and stubbornness. The journey itself was a lesson in the scale of the disaster. Trains crammed with wounded going one way, trains full of fresh-faced replacements going the other, endless fields and forests under a sky where the war seemed distant and the land eternal. Then the smell of Stalingrad began to seep into the air, smoke, oil, the sour tang of unwashed clothes and nerves. He arrived not as a legendary sniper, but as an ordinary sailor, reassigned as a rifleman to the 284th Rifle Division. His first weapon was a standard infantry rifle like everyone else's. In those days, the battle for Stalingrad was still a brutal, close-up affair, house by house, room by room. Men killed each other with grenades, bayonets, entrenching tools. Artillery and dive bombers hammered the city until streets became trenches and apartment blocks became fortresses. The Volga behind them was both lifeline and trap, full of boats trying to bring ammunition and men across under constant shell fire. Everybody was afraid. The difference lay in what they did with that fear. The first time he used a rifle in Stalingrad the way he had used one in the Urals, it was almost an accident. His unit was pinned down by German fire near a factory complex, the air full of dust and chips of brick as machine gun rounds tore into walls. The Germans had dug in opposite, confident in their positions, trading jokes between bursts of fire, trusting in numbers, and in the idea that the Soviets could not move without being cut down. Zaytsev watched them from a crawl space, eyes narrowed against the dust, and saw something that made his fingers itch. 3 German officers stood together for a moment near a broken wall, heads bent over a map, or maybe just talking about something they assumed only mattered to them. They believed they were beyond reach. He asked for a sniper rifle on the spot. His commander, wary and exhausted, looked at the quiet sailor with the steady eyes and shrugged. There were never enough rifles anyway, and if this man could use one well, it was worth a try. Someone produced a scoped Mosin-Nagant 9130, heavy and long. It was not a precision instrument by modern standards, but in the hands of a man who understood what a rifle could be, it was more than adequate. He settled behind a ruined wall, adjusted the scope, and breathed. The distance was long, but not absurd by the standards of his childhood. The hardest part was tuning out everything else, the crump of mortars, the shouting, the crash of masonry collapsing as another shell found its mark. In the scope, the 3 officers swam into clarity, their collars and insignia bright slashes against grey rubble. He aimed not at the group, but at the man in the middle, the one whose posture suggested authority. When he squeezed the trigger, the recoil was a familiar punch. Through the glass, he saw the officer snap backward, a red eruption where his chest had been. The second man turned, mouth open. Zaytsev shifted and fired again. The third tried to run and got 3 steps before the third round caught him at the base of the neck. 3 shots, 3 men. The machine gun fire that had pinned his comrades faltered as German soldiers shouted and scrambled, suddenly aware that they were not alone in their own killing ground. When they finally dragged the bodies away, it was with the jittery movements of men who knew that someone was watching from an unseen place. That was the day his war changed. To his superiors, it was proof that they had something rare. A man who could do with a rifle what others barely managed with artillery. To the men around him, it was proof that the Germans could be killed from a distance in a way that felt almost surgical. To himself, it felt like inevitability. The skills he had been given as a boy had finally found the environment they were built for, even if no one could have imagined that environment when his grandfather pointed at a rock across a valley. He was assigned as a sniper and given freedom of movement most soldiers could only dream about. Stalingrad was full of good vantage points if you were willing to climb, crawl, and risk being cut off. Chimneys, half-collapsed stairwells, the upper stories of buildings that had lost everything below but still clung to a fragment of roof. He learned quickly that a sniper in a city was as much an engineer as a marksman. You needed loopholes, small openings chipped in walls that allowed a rifle barrel to protrude without giving away its position. You needed escape routes. You needed patience. Days began before dawn. With 1 or 2 other men, sometimes a spotter, sometimes another sniper, he would pick his way through ruins to a position chosen the day before. They would lie there for hours, barely moving, scraping a little more dust into place over hands, sleeves, barrel. In winter, the cold was an enemy as much as the Germans. Breath condensed on metal, fingers went numb, bodies ached from lying on brick and concrete. At first, he wore standard issue gear. Later, he and others put together improvised camouflage, white sheets in snow, rags that broke up the outline of shoulders and helmets, smearing soot or dust on exposed skin. His tally began to climb. 10, 20, 50. Each kill notched in a small notebook he carried, along with rough details, the location, the circumstances, the apparent rank or role of the target. This was partly record-keeping, partly propaganda fodder. The Soviet press loved numbers. "This comrade has killed ex-fascists" was a powerful line in a newspaper read by men and women who had seen their cities burned. It was proof that the slaughter was not entirely one-sided, that there were individuals on their side capable of dealing out death as effectively as any German. But numbers were also a way to remain sane in an environment where anything could vanish in an instant. Reducing an encounter to a few lines in a notebook made it manageable. The Germans did not have names in that book, only tallies. Over time, the entries blurred into a pattern. German sniper in attic, machine gunner at window, officer directing assault in factory yard. He killed them while they smoked, while they spoke, while they ran from one pile of rubble to another. Sometimes it was messy, a man blown backward in a spray of brick dust and blood. Sometimes it was almost gentle, a helmet simply toppling off a head that folded slowly. In 2 months, between late September and December 1942, his confirmed tally reached 225 German soldiers and officers. The actual number may have been higher. In the chaos of Stalingrad, confirmation was an art, not a science. What mattered was that the Germans noticed. Their casualty reports began to include references to Soviet snipers, mentions of routes that could no longer be used in daylight, of men who refused to cross open ground without smoke cover because there is a Russian with glass eyes watching. Some sectors of the front went eerily quiet during daylight as German units learned to fear any exposed posture. Zaytsev knew that fear was part of his weapon. Killing a man reduced the enemy's numbers. Making 10 men afraid to move reduced their effectiveness just as surely. He chose his targets with that in mind. Officers were high priority, not out of personal hatred, but because a unit without leadership stumbled. Machine gunners, because their weapons controlled lanes of movement. Sappers and telephone layers, because they connected the German line. He also hunted other snipers. That was the most dangerous work of all, hunting someone who hunted back. The duel between snipers was a game of mirrors and patience. Each looked for the other's smallest mistake, a glint of light on glass, an unnatural straight line where everything else was jagged, a thread of smoke from a poorly concealed cigarette. Sometimes the duel lasted hours, sometimes days. It was in this shadow war that one of the most famous and most debated episodes of his career unfolded. The duel with the German expert the Soviets would later call Major König. The story, as it was told during the war and for years afterwards, went like this. German command, alarmed by the effect Soviet snipers were having on their troops, brought in a specialist from their own sniper school, an officer whose tally was in the hundreds, whose job was to break the back of the Soviet sniper movement by killing its symbol. Whether this man's name was König, or whether he existed at all as a single individual, rather than as a composite of several German sharpshooters, historians can argue. For the men in Stalingrad, the name did not matter as much as the reality that someone expert was out there, methodically picking off Soviet officers and artillery spotters, leaving a trail of precisely placed corpses. The duel played out in the rubble around a factory complex where the front line had stabilized for a time. Soviet officers trying to observe were killed as soon as they exposed themselves. Dispatch riders didn't make it across courtyards. Zaytsev and his spotter, Nikolai Kulikov, were assigned to find and kill the German. Days went by. The German sniper did not rush. That, in itself, was a sign of his skill. An amateur was greedy. A professional was patient. They studied the terrain the way a hunter studies a familiar valley. Where could a sniper hide to see what the German obviously saw? What lines of sight did he have? Slowly, they narrowed it down to a small patch of nowhere much, a piece of ground between a wrecked tank and a twisted length of rail track, overlooked by a smashed concrete bunker. No obvious windows, no easy loopholes. But there was one oddity, a small sheet of metal leaning at an angle that did not match the rest of the debris, as if it had been placed there, not fallen. Zaytsev guessed that the German might have cut a firing slit under that piece of metal, using it as cover. If he had, any movement toward that spot would be death. So they did nothing that looked like movement. For hour after hour they stayed low, watching through broken glass and cracks, muscles screaming. The sun moved, shadows shifted. At one point, a Soviet helmet was raised slightly on a stick, a classic decoy. A shot cracked. The helmet jumped. The angle of the bullet confirmed their suspicion. The German was under the plate. Then came the worst part, waiting for him to make a mistake. Not a big one, just a momentary change. A brief shift in the position of the plate as he adjusted his field of vision or his body. The air thickened. Their eyes burned. Every sound seemed distant. At last, near evening, Zaytsev thought he saw it. A flicker in the edge of the metal's outline. Maybe it was imagination. Maybe it was nothing. He fired just beneath the plate. At the point a man would rest his head if he were trying to use the tiniest opening. There was a metallic ring, the sound of something heavy hitting the inside of concrete. Later, cautiously, they approached and found a body twisted into a cramped space, a scope shattered, an eye ruined. In his memory, in his memoirs, in the stories told to Soviet troops, that man was König, the Nazi master sniper brought low by the peasant hunter. Whether or not Berlin actually ordered a specific duel, the psychological reality was undeniable. After that, it was the Germans who felt hunted when they lifted a periscope or peered from a ruin. More important than any single duel was what grew around him. Stalingrad produced not just one sniper, but a whole movement. Under his guidance, a sniper school took shape in the ruins, hardly a school in the traditional sense, more a circle of men lying on cold floors while he talked quietly about angles and breathing, about choosing a position that did not tempt you to fire too soon. He taught them to work in pairs, to cover each other, to never use the same nest twice if it could be avoided. He showed them how to gauge the direction and strength of the wind from the way smoke drifted from a burning beam, how to use broken glass not as a hazard, but as a mirror to see around corners. They came from everywhere: factory workers, clerks, Siberian hunters, young women who had grown up with rifles on collective farms. Some had never fired at anything more threatening than a target on a range. Others had shot wolves in forests that now seemed as distant as another planet. Under his instruction and under the pressure of the siege, they hardened quickly. Each of them, he insisted, was not just a killer, but a teacher. For every sniper he trained, that sniper was expected to train 3 more. It was a grim form of multiplication, knowledge turned into a weapon that spread through the ranks faster than any formal directive from above. The effect was cumulative. German patrols began to move like men in a minefield. The simple act of crossing a street became a calculus of risk. A helmet bobbing above a wall without a body under it meant an instant shot. Soon, fake helmets appeared, mounted on sticks, bait for Soviet sharpshooters. The sniper war became layered with such tricks. A piece of cloth left flapping in a window might conceal a rifle muzzle, or might just be cloth. A corpse left in the open might be tied to a tripwire, or might conceal a sniper under it. There is a photograph taken in Stalingrad of a dead horse whose bloated flank has been cut away to make a firing position. Whether Zaytsev himself used that exact trick or not, the mentality was his. All this took a toll on bodies and minds. Lying still for hours in winter temperatures, tears at flesh and nerves. There were days when frostbite bit fingers that could not be warmed by rubbing without giving away a position. There were nights when the sound of a German voice drifting across rubble set teeth on edge, not because of the words, but because it meant someone was close enough to kill and yet invisible. Men dreamed of scopes, of crosshairs aligning on faces that turned into friends at the last second. Some broke. No amount of early hunting prepared a man for the sustained intimacy of killing people who, at a distance, could look very much like himself. Zaytsev's own breaking point, when it came, was physical rather than mental. In January 1943, near the end of the battle, a mortar shell exploded near his position. Shards of metal tore into his face, some embedded in his eyes. For a sniper, it was the worst possible wound. He was evacuated across the Volga in a boat that pitched and lurched under shellfire. The world around him was a blur of pain and light. In the overworked medical facilities farther east, surgeons debated what, if anything, could be done. He was sent to the hospital of Professor Filatov, a pioneer in eye surgery. A man who had spent months staring down a rifle scope now lay in a bed staring at bandages he couldn't see, listening to footsteps and instruments and the calm voice of a doctor who had his own war to fight against shrapnel and infection. For a time, it seemed possible that he would be blind. The irony was brutal. A lifetime spent honing vision, a few seconds to lose it. But the surgery worked. Sight returned, not perfectly, but enough. Enough to read, enough to see faces, enough to function. The war had other uses for him now. Teaching, inspiring, appearing as the living embodiment of the slogan, "Not one step back." He would return to combat, but the concentrated day-after-day sniper work in Stalingrad was behind him. By then, his legend had already outstripped his person. Soviet newspapers had published his story, adorned with necessary embellishments. Pamphlets and posters bore his name, urging soldiers to learn from Comrade Zaytsev in their own sectors. His tally of kills, 225, then 242, and higher if unconfirmed and post-Stalingrad kills were counted, became a kind of currency. In an army that had once measured heroism in bayonet charges and artillery barrages, there was now room for the quiet hunter, whose weapon was precision and patience. The numbers were not just Soviet invention. German records after the war contained references to the terrible effect of Soviet snipers in Stalingrad, of entire units pinned and bled without ever seeing their attackers. It is impossible to draw a direct line from every hesitant German step to the man from the Urals, but the principle he embodied had rippled outward. He had shown that in modern industrial war, where armies churned through rivers of steel and fuel, there was still room for the individual who could, with one bullet, alter the fate of a company, a platoon, a moment. After Stalingrad, he continued to fight. He served through the rest of the war, participating in operations that pushed the front westward across Ukraine, Romania, into Germany itself. He rose in rank, eventually becoming a captain. The scale of the war changed. Battles on fields rather than ruins, wide advances instead of block-by-block struggles. But the lessons he had learned in the ruins stayed with him. Even when he was not acting as a sniper, he thought like one. Always looking for vantage points, always measuring angles, always aware that unseen eyes might be on him. When the war finally ended in May 1945 and Berlin lay in ruins of its own, he was one of millions demobilized into a country that had to learn how to be something other than a battlefield. He became an engineer in a factory in Kiev, a city that had seen its own share of horror and restoration. He married, had a family, lived in an apartment building where the biggest daily concern might be a leaky pipe or a line at the store. For years he was largely anonymous, known to those who lived near him as a quiet man with a limp and a certain way of looking at distances. The state remembered him when it needed to. On anniversaries of the battle, he was invited to speak, to stand at memorials, to lay wreaths. Younger soldiers shook his hand as if the contact might transmit some of his steadiness. Writers came, notebooks in hand, to coax more stories out of him. He gave them some and kept others. The official version of his life smoothed edges, turning him into a neat archetype. In reality, he remained what he had always been. A man who had once lain for hours in cold rubble waiting for another man to show himself long enough to die. Years after his death in 1991, his remains were reburied in Volgograd, the city Stalingrad had become. Near the hill called Major König, where the great statue of motherland towers over a landscape that still hides fragments of steel and bone, there is a memorial stone with his name. Tourists climb the long stairs, winded and awed, and many of them pass that stone without noticing. Those who do notice may know only the barest outline. Sniper, hero, hundreds of kills. Few of them will have spent hours lying on their stomachs staring down a sight at a patch of empty air, waiting. The statistics are easy to repeat. He killed at least 225 Germans in 2 months. He trained dozens of snipers whose own tallies climbed into the hundreds. A single sniper movement, born in the ruins of one city, accounted for thousands of enemy casualties across the Eastern Front. The raw arithmetic is impressive, but the real weight of his story lies in how it rewrote expectations. Before Stalingrad, many believed that the only way to stop a modern army was with bigger guns, more tanks, more planes. Zaytsev showed that one man with a rifle and the right mindset could slow an enemy division, could force it to crawl where it had once run. He showed that fear, when precisely applied, was as real a weapon as any shell. German soldiers who had marched across half of Europe now flinched at windows, hesitated before crossing streets, ordered smoke screens for movements that once would have been routine. Generals who had thought in kilometers began to think in meters when reading reports from sniper-plagued sectors. He also demonstrated something about the relationship between individual skill and industrial mass. The rifles he used were factory products, cheap by the standards of weapon systems. The bullets were one more line in the staggering output of Soviet munitions plants. There was nothing exotic in his equipment. The difference lay in the mind and body behind the weapon. A shape-charged shell could kill a tank. A man like Zaytsev could decide which tank commander never got the chance to use his. In his later years, when asked how he felt about the number of men he had killed, he answered in the language his time demanded. He spoke of duty, of fascist invaders, of defending the motherland. Beneath the slogans, there were hints of weariness. No one can spend that much time looking into a scope at human beings without paying some price. Yet if there was regret, he kept it mostly to himself. The war had not asked if he was ready to be a sniper. It had simply presented him with a choice. Use what you know or let others die. He chose, and history followed. In the end, his life looks, on paper, almost simple. Born poor, taught to hunt, went to war, killed many enemies, survived, worked in a factory, died. But between those lines lies the strange, brutal intimacy of the sniper's world. Lying on a rooftop in a ruined city, breathing slow, watching a man hundreds of meters away lift his head just a little higher than he should, deciding in that second that this man, out of all the men on the battlefield, will not see another sunrise. Feeling the rifle buck, seeing the head jerk, noting in a small notebook one more line that moves a number upward. Vasily Zaytsev's story is not one of invention or industrial miracle. It is the story of a person, flesh and blood, fallible, stubborn, who discovered that the skills of a village boy could, in the right circumstances, alter the course of a battle that would help decide the fate of continents. In the ruins of Stalingrad, where factories lay open to the sky and stairwells ended in nothing, he showed that modern war still had room for the hunter, and that one man with a rifle could make an entire army walk differently. Long after the last shells stopped falling, after the banners faded and the medals gathered dust in drawers, that is what remains. Somewhere in the numbers, 225 confirmed kills, hundreds more unconfirmed, scores of students trained, divisions slowed, is a man lying quietly in the dust, counting his breaths, watching, waiting for a small mistake on the far side of a ruined street.